Good morning, everyone. It's absolutely lovely to see you on day 3 now. How is everybody feeling? Have you, anyone who has gotten into a storm yesterday? Not really, everyone was safe here. Anyone who has heard some interesting content? Yes, please. More and more of hands are coming up. Thank you so much. Anyone who has been checking the app to see the photos, because there are thousands of them? Good. You should be continuing to do that, looking for yourself in the photos. But in case you have not done so, a really good encouragement, I think, will be this video, the wrap-up of day 2, that we are going to show on the screens tomorrow. So as you are gathering, let us, for a couple of minutes, watch this video together.
Adopted a systemic approach to combating corruption grounded in prosecution, prevention, and education.
Conference is always a valuable opportunity to bring together all those actively engaged in the fight against corruption.
Thank you so much. Judging from this video, I think yesterday was very formal, lots of content, everyone was super serious. While we were watching the video of the day 1, there were some celebrations involved, which I know that not all of you have attended, and some of you have regretted not attending. So this is just for me to say that there's no need to regret, because tonight there's going to be another celebration, and I'm announcing it now, so everybody who is coming here can actually hear and remember at 7:30. Yes, it is on your program, but today is actually the longest day there is and the shortest night. So there will be a summer solstice celebration that we will have in Hall 1 at 7:30. It's all inclusive. Whoever regretted not coming to the opening festival or celebration, do remember that at 7:30 you're all invited, and that's after all of the sessions that will happen throughout many venues here today. But just one thing that you need to remember, 7:30, everyone gathers together to celebrate. Before that happens, there is a film. Yes, obviously there are plenaries and there are workshops, and it's all in your program. But at 5, there's a very important film, State of Silence, that talks about the violence against journalists in Mexico. If you're not familiar with the situation, Mexico is one of the most unsafe, if not the most dangerous place for journalists to work outside the war zones, obviously. So there's a film, State of Silence, that we very much encourage you to see. And we will move on with the plenary 4, Building a Global Ethical Economy, Advancing Business Integrity and its Leaders. And it is my great honor to introduce to you Moderator Olajobi Makinwa, who is with us and who will present and introduce all of the panel. And I think we greet them with a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to welcome you to our private sector executive panel, where we will delve into the crucial intersections of business, ethics, sustainability, and global prosperity. In today's world, businesses exert significant influence on the economy, shaping not just financial outcomes, but also social and environmental impacts. It is heartening to see enterprises harnessing their power and goodwill to bring about positive change, regardless of their size. As we navigate through the landscape of business leadership, we can't overlook the ethical dilemmas and risks that often come with the territory. However, by facing these challenges head-on, leaders can drive meaningful progress toward a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous world economy. Today, we aim to explore the current opportunities and obstacles that stand in the way of advancing these noble goals. How can each of us, as businesses and industry leaders, leverage our resources and influence to foster fairness and sustainable for all? After all, businesses cannot thrive where there is chaos and poverty. How has collective action among industry players shaped a business ecosystem centered on integrity? It is our collective responsibility to drive these changes, and together we can make a significant impact for the world that we all want. During the discussion, we will shine a spotlight on exemplary organizations that are setting new standards and practices in ethical conduct and integrity within the private sector. By highlighting these trailblazers, we seek to inspire and motivate others to follow suit and raise the bar for ethical business practices. I'm hopeful that we can collectively engage in meaningful conversations, share valuable insights, and collectively chart a course toward a future where business not only thrives, but also serves as a force for good in our interconnected world. This panel discussion, therefore, is a significant step in that direction, and I'm confident our collective efforts will lead to a brighter and more sustainable future. Let us embark on this enlightening session together as we explore the transformative power of ethical leadership in shaping a brighter tomorrow. We are honored to have all of you here this morning. With this said, let me continue to have the privilege of introducing our distinguished panel of private sector executives and critical stakeholders who bring a wealth of experience, expertise, and insights to today's discussion. I'd like to introduce Ms. Alison Taylor, who is a clinical associate professor, New York University Stern School of Business. Mr. Andreas Schwarz, Deputy Director General, European Anti-Fraud Office, OLAF. Ms. Annette Kraus, Chief Compliance Officer, Siemens. Ms. Jisha Dymond, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, OneTrust. That's Jisha there. Mr. Klaus Moosmayer, Executive Committee Member and Chief Ethics, Risk and Compliance Officer, Novartis. Mr. Nicola Allocca, Director, Risk, Business Integrity, Resilience and Quality Director, OECD Anticorruption, and also OECD Anticorruption Committee, and Chair of Business at OECD, that's what, Anticorruption Committee. That's Peter. And then, last but not the least, Mr. Peter Eigen, founder and former chairman of Transparency International. And I'm told that the late Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kofi Annan, referred to Peter as the father of the 10th principle of the UN Global Compact. Yeah. And Peter, on Monday, 24th of June, the 10th principle will be 20 years old. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'm going to turn to you, Nicola, as Director for Business Integrity, Resilience and Anticorruption for Autostrade per Italia, one of the most important motorway operators in Europe, and chair of the Business of OECD Anticorruption Committee. Could you tell us what are the current opportunities and obstacles to advance a sustainable, equitable, and prosperous global economy? Thank you. Over to you.
Buongiorno a tutti. Oggi vi parlerò di corruzione, illustrandovi quelle che sono le migliori pratiche per eliminare questa piaga che va a impattare il futuro delle prossime generazioni. I think that most of you haven't understood what I have just said. This is how they feel when we talk about anti-corruption. I'm sure that everyone of you can relate and agree that we need more CEOs talking about anti-corruption. 2024, this year, is a critical year in the fight against corruption. As the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention turns 25, the UN Global Compact Principle 10 turns 20 years, and we should understand the momentum. It could be an opportunity to switch our vision. Following the discussion of the last 3 days, it's clear that we need an urgent action plan. We could call it a switch to growth. It can strengthen the real economy in this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, liquid and modern world. As a representative of the business at OECD, a network of over 10 million corporations in more than 55 countries, and senior executive of Autostrade per l'Italia, which is one of the most important players in the infrastructure industry, I can say that businesses need to develop a long-term vision which considers both planet challenges and opportunities. In this regard, corruption is the challenge, but zero corruption is the opportunity. There is a European Parliament study calculating the impact of corruption on EU GDP. If we eliminate corruption only in Europe, we can eliminate hunger, provide drinking water globally, and assure free healthcare to the poorest countries. And we will still have additional resources left. So, if we allow corruption to deprive the next generation of key resources such as education, healthcare, security and safety standards, environmental rights, social wellness, we will inflict an intolerable burden of inequality on our children. For this reason, we must have the courage to admit that it is possible to eliminate corruption and to give to this target its proper dignity in the UN SDG agenda. In order to translate this commitment into action, we have issued a manifesto that calls for the treatment of zero corruption as an 18th SDG. It is a multi-stakeholder paper that can be applied by public and private organizations, business representatives, and corporations. The manifesto puts forward the 10 key actions in order to build a more resilient, responsible, sustainable, and corruption-resistant global economy. We have clusterized these 10 actions in 3 main groups which represent the essential dimensions of our race to zero. So in the first cluster, we have to change the way we think about corruption. This means that we have to break biases, that corruption cannot be eliminated. This means that corporations should implement anti-corruption measures with the aim of eradicating and not just managing corruption risks. On second cluster, we have creating meaningful tools and taking impactful measures. It includes stimulating responsible conduct. It includes protecting and supporting brave voices. It includes using tech for trust and transparency. And last but not least, promoting the freedom of the press. On this, I would like just to congratulate IACC for setting the tone and underlining the importance of vigilant media, which protects our society by uncovering the truth and assurance transparency. The last cluster is on how we act together globally. Collective action is vital in order to build a more resilient business ecosystem with zero corruption. So in conclusion, the manifesto forges an alliance between us and those who will come after us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicola. We need to take care of future generations. We need to take care of our own greed, so that at the end of the day, we can take care of the future generations. Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Alison.
Hi.
Alison, you've heard what Nicola said. So, what, in your own opinion, are the main challenges impacting the global economy today? And while answering that question, please zero in on the resultant opportunities or obstacles to integrity by business leaders.
Sure. So maybe what I would like to start by saying is, I think the story of anti-corruption in the private sector illustrates this incredible paradox. I started working in anti-corruption around 2001, and I don't think anyone back then would have predicted the level of consensus and cooperation that we have globally on anti-corruption. There is pretty much a clear idea about what a good anti-corruption compliance program looks like. We need officials, we need diligence, we need whistleblowing, we need investigations. Your business partners know they need to sign agreements saying they won't pay bribes. Our regulators cooperate. It is an incredible achievement of global cooperation. I work also a lot in environmental sustainability and human rights and climate change. And the level of regulatory consensus we've achieved on anti-corruption is something that practitioners in those worlds absolutely just dream of. At the same time, real questions to be asked about what we've achieved with these internally focused compliance measures and how we can get further and start to consider some of the issues that Nicola talked about in terms of collective action and what we need to do, to move to tackle these issues. At the same time, over this time period, we have seen that international compliance frameworks are becoming increasingly misaligned. So, for example, you can no longer meet new EU emerging human rights frameworks and without breaking Chinese espionage laws. So there's real misalignment on questions like privacy and freedom of expression. And then in terms of how the public feels, and particularly how young people feel, I think many of the challenges that strike them have not been yet tackled by legal compliance. So things like climate change and human rights challenges, I think, show us that the law can only get us so far. We need voluntary action. We need cooperation between the private sector, civil society, and governments. And that is fiendishly difficult to achieve, and even more difficult to achieve in an era where we are dominated by polarization, misinformation, and then a decline in global corruption. So it's this story of phenomenal achievement, and then the story also at the same time of the limitations of what we can achieve with the frameworks and core ideas we've put in place. So I think there's a challenge to all of us in the private sector to think about internal governance, to think about how we're going to engage with other institutions, and to really push beyond the idea that this is a question that the CEO can delegate and then forget about while they focus on more important things, because arguably there's nothing more important. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you. I'm really glad that you focus on the achievements and the fact that we've come a long way since 2001.
Right.
And since the Global Compact's 10th principle also was adopted, 20 years ago, we've come a long way. In those days, businesses many of them never wanted to speak on anti-corruption.
I would be in meetings
and here
then,
we are today.
It was a taboo topic. You would raise the topic in a meeting in the early 2000s and people would act kind of like they act when you talk about human rights violations now.
Yeah.
A silence would descend. No one wanted to hear about it. So what we have achieved is remarkable.
Yes, but we still have a lot to achieve. And please have your questions ready. We're going to give you about 20 minutes of Q&A later. Thank you. Thank you, Alison. And I'm going to come to you, Jisha. Alison mentioned the issue of CEOs, the responsibilities of CEOs. So, going further with leadership, the CEO, the board of directors, do they have a role in promoting business integrity? Isn't it the role of the chief compliance officer or somebody like you, the chief ethics and compliance officer? So can you please provide us with a few of the core characteristics of an ethical business leader and his or her impact on the corporate culture?
Yes, thank you,
Does leadership matter at all?
Yes,
Yeah,
of course.
thank you.
And I think Nicola and Alison mentioned the role of the CEO and the board of directors in this whole collective action, right? The thing about coming to these programs is we all agree with each other. We all agree, yes, the CEO has a role. And I agree, you agree, we agree. But how do we get them to agree? And how do we get them to act? As Alison mentioned, compliance programs we can build, right? Annette, Klaus, we're all in the roles of building the programs, creating the policies, the procedures, the training, the internal controls. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a good culture in your company, none of that matters. And culture has so much to do with what the board of directors and the CEO say the culture is. Someone said to me before an analogy for companies, it's like the human body, right? Lots of parts working together. And the DNA is the culture, right? And so it's integrated. It's in everything that we do. And I think that when the board and the CEO don't understand that, we have a problem, and it doesn't matter what the compliance officer does. So how do we get them to engage? How do we make them understand? I do think we live in an age now where people want to do business with ethical companies. We see CEOs being booted for unethical behavior, not even illegal behavior. We see that across headlines all the time. And so now we live in a generation where someone can record the CEO on their phone, post it on social media, and done. Career's over. So they are starting to understand that. And I think there's jurisprudence and laws that focus on director and officer liability, their obligation to oversee the company. And we're seeing a lot more enforcement of courts and the justice system saying it's not enough. You have to do more. You have to do more oversight. So what do we do? How do we elevate that conversation? I think that as compliance officers or those of us that are in the conference rooms, instead of saying, oh, yes, I built the program, here is the record of the training, we have to elevate the conversation with the CEOs and the boards and say, can we reframe our discussions as ethical decisions as opposed to business decisions? There are studies that show that the minute you start talking about a decision in the framework of ethics as opposed to business, it's not a management decision. Let's talk about the management decision, but let's also talk about it in an ethical framework. The results differ significantly. And so I think that our role as the leaders in our companies in compliance and risk management is to elevate that conversation and say, yes, we will build the programs, but let's have a conversation that's much more collective so we can affect the culture of our companies and have much more effectiveness and impact.
Thank you, Jisha. Thank you very much indeed. Leadership does matter a lot. Mm-hmm. And if the head is spoiled, the whole body is spoiled.
Yeah.
So thank you. Now I'm going to go to Klaus. You recently explored the need for a novel organizational framework for business integrity in corporations known as ethics and integrated assurance. You did that in a in an opinion piece you wrote recently. So can you please explain what you mean by ethics and integrated assurance, and how is this relevant to advancing businesses and business leaders with integrity as a cornerstone? Can you please explain that?
Yeah, thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
First to Jisha, maybe, because I think we need to talk practical examples. And as a member of the council for this conference, I was sad to come late to this conference yesterday night, but for a good reason, because we had the board of directors meeting as an executive committee, and one topic was ethical use of AI on the discussion with the board, for example. And I think what you said is super relevant. Check the board agenda. Check the agenda of the executive committee. Are these topics really on the agenda? And is it not only a PowerPoint slide battle, or is it an open discussion? No one is perfect. There's no paradise, no perfect cooperation in this world, but at least are the corporations on the highest level, as you said, trying to make this a topic. Also, the board of directors and the executive committee is owning. But now to the integrated assurance and ethics. I mean, I think we listened to Alison and to Nicola, and this is, I think, clear in this room. There's a change. Compliance can't be a silo in the company anymore. It was. When I started 25 years ago, the battlefield of compliance, compliance was basically an anti-corruption department in the legal organization. This can't be. We see that it's all getting together. Human rights was mentioned, ESG was mentioned. Big part of my time is risk and crisis management in the company. This is very much connected to corruption. Just think about the COVID rescue funds we all put in place, ad hoc support, a huge bribery corruption risk was in there as well. You can't do an anti-bribery due diligence only for the party. There's a human rights topic as well. There's a safety and health issue, a workers' rights issue as well included. Therefore, to your question, yes, we believe that we need to change the internal setup, how companies operate on anti-corruption and compliance. And this integrated assurance means a concept which brings the things organizationally also together. The ethics debate, we're not owning ethics, as you said, but we can be a catalyst for ethical dilemmas we often cannot solve, but we can trigger at least a transparent discussion. We need to drive holistic risk and crisis management in the company, because only if you have defined your ethical appetite and borderline, you can define your risk management. And then you build a holistic and effective compliance program on it. So it's basically connecting governance topics, risk management, the control, and the compliance organization in horizontal instead of a vertical kind of setup in companies. Because only then you have the full picture, and you can be at the table of management and of the board of directors to have really a high-level debate. This is not without cost. And many companies say we do all on compliance, and then you ask, what is your budget? How many headcount do you have? Are you sitting at the management table? Are you down somewhere in the legal department? By the way, and I know this may be controversial, I really advocate for a clear separation between the legal department and the compliance organization. Legal is super relevant, but we have different roles in our organization. And this is something the companies, I believe, should take on to have a better position to be a partner in the societal fight against corruption, because we can't win it alone in the private sector or in civil society or in business. It has to be together in the sense of integrated assurance. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So governance, risk management, compliance, internal controls, they are all interrelated. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to come to you now, Annette. Your company, Siemens, has faced numerous challenges on some of the issues being discussed here today. Leadership issues, corruption, integrity issues here. You've had that in the past, with serious implications for your company, isn't it? Can you please share with us what strategies have proven successful for Siemens in navigating the corruption risks with integrity and nurturing ethical leaders? How can these lessons be scaled up so that other companies can learn from your challenges in the past and where you are today? and focusing more on integrity and business leadership.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yobi. And just to bring us all back in the picture, I mean, Alison, you were mentioning your starting point with anti-corruption in 2001. Also, 2001 was for Siemens a very important point in time. Why? Because that was when we were US listed as a company. And then in 2006, many of you might know, the big Siemens corruption scandal absolutely hit at us. We were facing a lot of regulatory investigations with, as you said, Yobi, quite significant consequences for the company. What does this mean? I mean, just imagine we are, or the company at the time in 2006, 700,000 colleagues around the globe. They were facing in the news internally this big corruption scandal. Out of a sudden, Siemens, the company they have been working for such a long time in the press, associated with big failures, all out of a sudden involved in this big corruption scandal. So this was really a wake-up call for Siemens. We almost lost our license to operate, specifically in the US, but also in Germany and in other big markets. But it was also a wake-up call for the international cooperation community, right? They realized anti-corruption is really a thing. We need to really take care of that to not face the same situation as Siemens is facing. So I would say, if I look back, reflecting, what are strategies to avoid? What are the big lessons learned out of this corruption scandal? Let's first look on internal strategies. I think what is really key is to clean up immediately without compromise. And a lot has been said about ethical leadership, about the importance of the management, the top management, the right tone from the top. But this is really key if you are in a situation where 700,000 employees live in a culture that they have been thinking we have been doing the right thing, but obviously it was not, right? As this big corruption scheme has been unveiled by the agencies around the globe. So it's also about then readjusting the culture, setting and defining the right compass again. What is integrity for a global player as Siemens? I mean, again, it's about people, right? The mindset of people, making sure that they understand this is not the way how we can be doing business. This hasn't been the right thing to do. So what does it mean then to do the right thing? So it's about creating awareness, explaining, training, upskilling, internally, clear focus. And then again, clear tone from the top. What does it mean to do only clean business? And then, once this first clean up has been done, I think it was a clear focus to make it sustainable for Siemens. And that is obviously to have a very robust compliance management system in place. I mean, Alison, you mentioned that a lot has been developed. There are state-of-the-art compliance management systems out there. But what is really key, you cannot lean back and just remain with the same system, but to really make it sustainable, you need to develop it further, continuously, very actively, seeing what are the risks external, but also internally. How can I make my system better? Also, in light of all the digital transformations, Klaus, you were mentioning AI, obviously that has a big impact on compliance management systems, on risk management from a risk landscape, but also how can we use those new technologies to even make our systems better, stronger, more robust. But not only how do you develop and adapt risk management systems, how can you make them more holistically, but also content-wise. the compliance management and risk management function has been developing significantly over the last 20 years. We started with classical anti-corruption, and now it is developing into all the social aspects of what is responsible business conduct for corporations. So it's no longer about only making good money is the right thing to do, but it's about to support the business, our colleagues, the top management, to define what is really the right thing to do if we reflect on what is our corporate social responsibility. Human rights, also the regulatory developments, the transformations in human rights from soft law now to hard law requirements, has a significant impact on the way how we are managing risks for corporations globally. And then even more so, if you want to make it sustainable, to really face and embrace the ethical concerns that are popping up in our global corporations all over the place. What do I mean with that? If you look, for example, at the situation in China or in Russia, with the increasing trade conflicts that we are facing, and then most importantly most significantly when Russia invaded Ukraine, what happened for global corporations, right? We had to deal with a lot of international sanctions. But what did that mean for our people on the ground in Russia? We had our managers in Russia that were facing criminal prosecution liabilities because they were implementing the sanctions that we have been imposing on them. So how do you solve, as a global company, those regulatory conflicts, right? You need a very clear understanding. What is it? What is responsible business conduct for you, right? How important is the safety of your employees in Russia? And same situation also for the teams in China, right? For Siemens, China is the second biggest market. Increasing conflicting situations where you need a clear ethical understanding, a clear ethical compass to navigate through those situations. So I think the value proposition for the compliance teams in corporations has also been significantly changing, and we are way more advising now the senior management, the top managements, on how they can actually navigate those very challenging ethical situations. And then, just to close on that, it's not only the internal strategies that make the fight against anti-corruption, the fight against the compliance risks globally sustainable. It's also teaming up with others. So it's really about developing and engaging in external ecosystem, because only then we can really make a difference.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you. Peter, I'm coming to you. You've heard the panelists talk about ethical dimension, the role of leadership, and all that. So does that mean that compliance is just not enough, for a business leader? I mean, for us to achieve the global world economy, is compliance not enough? Why are we talking about ethical leadership? Why are we talking about doing business with integrity?
Well, thanks very much for this question. I mean, looking at this panelists here, I'm so delighted. It's such a big difference, between what was sort of a consensus about corruption, in particular international corruption, about 30 years ago, when we went into creating Transparency International. And it is in this context that the question of compliance, whether this is really a goal which is good enough for us, should be sufficient. Because I remember a time when many of the companies, some of them represented on this panel here, told me what we are doing in China, what we are doing in Argentina, what we are doing in Nigeria, is absolutely compliant with German law. It's compliant with British law. It's compliant unless you bribe somebody in Britain. It's compliant with French law, with Japanese law, because they all had laws which protected their own civil society from corruption, protected their integrity, rather than protecting the integrity of decision makers in other countries. And so I thought compliant is not enough, because yes, it was compliant with German law. For instance, I was at the time the director of the regional office of the World Bank in Nairobi, and I saw many of these companies, highly respected companies with highly respected leaders and so on, coming into the country and systematically bribing decision makers, ministers, presidents in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And they told me, look, this is legal under German law and so on. So we had to struggle, for years to make sure that we don't accept this kind of compliance as an acceptable standard for business, because business was much too powerful, much too strong in a globalized economy, when many companies have much more power than national governments, for instance. So it was in this context that I think we should raise the bar for our ambition. And I'm so glad to hear from some of the speakers that they would like to build coalitions, that they want to work with others. And of course, I'm very much interested in giving a strong role of civil society and their organizations to interact with business and interact with governments. And therefore, I'm very pleased to see that some of you have mentioned this, and I feel that this interaction led to the changes in Germany. For instance, in 1999, the law was changed. So now in Germany, a German company which is bribing somebody in Asia or in Africa or Latin America will be punished, hopefully, while in the past one took a rather high-handed approach to this, including in the international intergovernmental institutions like the World Bank or like the United Nations, because they operated on the lowest common denominator of its member countries, which meant that in the World Bank, the members from Germany, from UK, from France, they didn't want the World Bank to get involved. I mean, with a great exception, of course, with the United States having passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act under Jimmy Carter's leadership in 1977-78. So this is what compliant meant at that time. And I'm so happy to see that we now see such a wonderful coalition of everybody to fight corruption. But this interaction with civil society and the other actors is extremely important. Not only the interaction with governments and business. Yesterday, one of the speakers was talking about the mafia of the coalition between government and business, which indeed could be a very damaging, unholy alliance. So I advocating very strongly a triangular interaction, multi-stakeholder cooperation, which then in their totality can lead to better results. So this kind of interaction, in particular with civil society, also in the other countries, in the other cultures. I mean, one of you mentioned culture as a decisive criterion for what is ethical, what is open, what is acceptable. Yes, but that you have to find out from civil society, from organized civil society. And therefore I promote very much this idea of multi-stakeholder activity in order to together determine what is the threshold we want to be compliant with. So it's very often not the law of the exporting countries or of the countries, the home countries of the companies, but it's very often something quite different in various parts of the world. And we have to interact there, civil society, business, and governments, in order to find the criteria for what is fair, what is ethical, what is acceptable. And I'm so happy to see such a such a coalescence of interest developing also on this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Thank you. Yes, compliance is not enough, and especially for companies in the global north. What is good for the goose is also good for the gander. Once you comply, I mean, over there in your own country, it's important also to do it also in the developing countries, and also to go beyond compliance, to operate business with integrity and with leadership. Right. Because businesses have so much power, and with power comes responsibility. Right. So it's not about complying in the developed countries, it's also ensuring that complying with the laws in the developing countries and operating business with integrity. Now, I'm coming to you, Andreas. Businesses, of course, we have corruption between businesses, but most of the time, like people say, it takes two to tango, right? And most of the time, corruption is actually initiated by government officials. And you've heard about the issue of integrity in business, and businesses are now operating with integrity. How can the public sector help the private sector or businesses to reinforce ethical behavior and to reduce the supply side of corruption? Do you have examples that you can share with us from the European experience? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Obi. And indeed, I'm representing here the public sector. I'm with the European Anti-Fraud Office, OLAF. And before I maybe explain a little bit what we do, let me first of all say that I fully agree with what was said here before, that ethical behavior, including strong anti-corruption policies of the private sector, have to come from the top. They have to be part of the corporate culture, and they have to go way beyond pure compliance. So I'm fully agreeing. And what I find interesting is that this is actually becoming a business case. Because if you're not ethical, you actually hurt your business. And that I find a very interesting development. Now, a few words on OLAF. OLAF is protecting the EU taxpayers' money. We investigate fraud and corruption affecting the EU budget. This year actually marks a very special occasion. OLAF is turning 25 years. And in that period, we have had more than 6,000 investigations into fraud and corruption. And we have made sure that 16 billion euros have been recommended to recover, so protecting the EU budget. Now, when I talk about the link of our work, and we are part of the European Commission and the private sector, of course, one important aspect is setting the framework. We are laying down the rules of the game, also for business. Let me maybe give you one example in that respect. We have recently changed the rules on conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is getting something very important, both with regard to the private sector, but also, of course, within the institution like the European Commission. We have now a uniform definition of the conflict of interest that is being applied, and that is also strictly enforced. And of course, with our investigations, we help to enforce the correct and ethical behavior also of companies. Now, when we look at the tools that we have, besides the investigations, we have a system, for example, if officials retire, or even if commissioners retire, they have to go through a so-called cooling off period. So they may not work for a private sector for a number of years in order not to benefit from the knowledge that they had acquired. We have a system, it's called Early Detection and Exclusion Database. If a company has been involved in fraud or with regard to the EU budget, they are in a database and cannot receive funding anymore. And finally, we have a huge data mining tool, huge database, where we collect information about all projects that are EU funded. where we also establish beneficial owners, so we see which company has benefited from what. So these are just some examples of how we try to link and with policies establish, well, policies and investigations establish that ethical behavior and that the rules are being applied. So in summary, of course, private and public sector need to work very closely together, and I'm extremely encouraged by what I've heard in this panel. And I think legislator on EU level, but of course also on the level of individual countries, can help shape the behavior of the private sector, and that should go hand in hand. Voilà.
Thank you. Governments can shape, the behavior of the private sector. That's very, very important. I'm going to go now into a set of other questions on collective action. Given the fact that we have agreed that, yes, indeed, companies have been doing a lot internally in terms of having their policies and practices in place, and having done all, can you walk alone in terms of addressing the challenges of corruption and stemming the tide against corruption? So we're going to look at some practical examples of collective action that has worked in the fight against corruption. But let me also say here that this session is going to be very short, given the also, as you can see, I have a big panel here. And yes, and Andreas, we have to leave at 11:45. So this session is going to be very fast, so that if you have any question you want to ask Andreas, you can post the questions to him before he leaves. Thank you. So I'm going to come to Nicola, Jisha, Klaus, and Annette, actually. Alison, we've talked about collective action. How has collective action fostered a business ecosystem of integrity? Do you have any examples of collective action that are setting new ethical and integrity standards and practices for the private sector? Any concrete examples that you want to share with us? So should I start with Klaus over there?
Yeah, I think we should start with us here, because this is a collective action, what is happening in Vilnius. You're all here for a reason, because you believe in exchange, in dialogue. And when we look where you're coming from, we have everyone here, civil society, public sector, the private sector, governments, everyone is here. So this is collective action live, so to say. Another practical example is the Compliance Without Borders project the OECD is driving. And this is, in several regards, super important. It is about an exchange between publicly owned companies and private companies on ethical standards, compliance standards, risk standards. This is important, of course, from a professional exchange, but also, I would say, from a psychology, that we need to overcome these barriers, this suspicion between the different sectors, which these barriers are still there. It's not so easy to talk to each other outside a conference. We are on stage, we talk. But the real work happens not here. This happens then when we come together to workshops and have the open dilemmas on the table. So this Compliance Without Borders collective action is a great dialogue. Go to the OECD website. There's a wonderful publicly available report about practical examples, what is happening there. That's a great example.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Jisha?
Yeah, excited about this topic. I think we all agree that being silos is not going to work, and collective action is absolutely necessary. For me, the example is, a bit private, where before I came to OneTrust, I was in social media at Twitter, but before that at Oxif Capital Management. If you studied anti-corruption, you know that the company was fined $400 million for a bribery scheme, and so I was part of the team brought in to meet our monitorship, our deferred prosecution agreement, and so very much on the ground answering the government's questions. Once we rebuilt our program, however, we came to the realization that the same troubles still existed. So we would go to developing countries, to purchase portfolio companies, to do investments, and we were still encountering the same problems of, corruption in the various sectors because of the jurisdictions we were in. It wasn't until we started having conversations with other large asset managers like ourselves. So mine, Oxif, was publicly traded. We started working with KKR, you might have heard of, and Apollo. These are big asset managers that have over billions of dollars of money that they invest. It wasn't until we came together and started having conversations and saying, we have to put up a front. One can't do it, and then the other does it. They know now where to go to get the money. And so it wasn't until we started putting together a consortium of asset managers that there was some movement in actually changing the behavior there and people on the ground realizing, oh, they're not going to give the bribe. And so for me, that collective action is something that is very real. It is something we had to do in order for us to not yet again have another enforcement action. So it's a very real, effective action.
Thank you, Jisha. Alison?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to think about this question in terms of how we are teaching and preparing our future business leaders. So I work in a business school, and I think the most important priority I have when I'm teaching my MBA students is to query some of the underlying assumptions of capitalism. Is business a zero-sum game? Are we just trying to eliminate the competition and screw our suppliers? Is that the way that we should think about running our businesses? And so how can we think about and leverage ideas of cooperation to drive change and win business advantage? So I think you need to start there, partly because then it gives students the tools and critical thinking to evaluate what they're hearing in other classes. Then when I'm teaching anti-corruption specifically and legal compliance specifically, we spend time thinking about corruption as a principal agent problem, thinking about the dominant approach in companies of saying there's a bad apple, we remove the bad apple, we no longer have a problem, and then really querying that. And so trying to get them to even understand conceptually that that will be a limitation for them to take steps to protect themselves, to protect their teams, and then to protect the reputations of the company when they are leaders. And so what I try to do then is to get them to this idea that this is not just a bad apple problem, this is not a problem you delegate, this is about impact, this is impact, the ultimate collective action problem. And then the final thing, I think, is thinking about stakeholder management, stakeholder thinking, negotiation, working with institutions and human beings with different values and ideas than you. And so I think there's a lot about the kind of concepts that you need to drive meaningful collective action in the private sector. Because there is there's a lot of collective action efforts. I think there are a lot of zombie coalitions that aren't really achieving very much. And so what I really think the onus and priority is to think about leadership in a different way, to think about driving influence in a different way, to even think about, when you're a future executive, is this a question of issuing orders from the top down and rolling out procedures? Or is this about building influence, driving change, in a more, intangible, transparent era? And so really, I think, challenging the students to think about the traditional assumptions of business, which are all about war and sport and competition, and to really reframe a different vision for business is what we need to do to move forward. And if we do that, collective action will be a lot easier and a lot more straightforward.
Thank you. I think our future is rosy. It's looking very good. Thank you. Thank you, Nicola.
Here I will try to add another point of view on what my colleagues have just said. So we can all agree that to have collective action, we need trust, because trust is key to enable cultural change and to break silos among relevant stakeholders. But in order to assure trust, we need to leverage technology. So, in my perspective, collective action should be also leveraged to scale up the use of technology and disseminate best practices among governments, businesses, and citizens. It is like a circle. Technology enables trust. Trust is the basis of collective action, but collective action can empower the use of technology to foster trust. In other terms, we need capacity building. This means helping to demystify different types of technology and educate people on their application. We need awareness raising on the demand side, which means promoting the use of different technologies to foster transparency and efficiency in the public sector processes. We need incentives and support from governments to corporations which use artificial intelligence to increase their compliance capacity. This demonstrates high-level political commitment in fighting corruption, but also sends a strong message that critical processes will be clean and fair. Last but not least, we need cross-border cooperation, fostering harmonization of digital aspects in order to level the playing field. So, put simply, the point of collective action is to deliver something that is good for governments, businesses, and citizens. As business at OECD, we delivered 3 main documents as collective action examples. The first, on one side, we have the manifesto, already mentioned in my previous answer, and it has the ambition of forging an alliance between the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. On the other side, we issued a paper on the importance of digital technology in the fight against corruption applied both to public and private sector. And we issued another paper addressing the importance of education in the fight against corruption, including the perspective of schools and universities, non-profit organizations, corporations, and public administrations. As a B2N Integrity Compliance Task Force, on which I have the honor to serve as co-chair, we have a specific policy action on collective action to foster the importance of integrity and resilience in the value chain. And in conclusion, to have effective collective action, governments, businesses, civil society, international organizations must come together as equal partners in order to translate the global commitments into tangible results and level the playing field.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So we need every one of us, all hands on deck. Peter, can you share with us your own experience with regards to the EIT and TI on collective action?
Yeah, I gladly do this. I mean, I should admit that I have a rather narrow interpretation of the term collective action. I mean, we use this very much in fighting corruption by creating agreements between competitors so that the moral hazard of stopping to bribe while the others continue is retained. Not retained, is controlled. So it's something which we address with integrity pacts at Transparency International. That is, for me, a typical case for collective action whereby everybody promises to stop bribing and you arrange legal systems where you have control of this, in particular, if you can do it in this triangular form, government, private sector, and civil society. So that's, for me, the sort of the pure term of collective action, which goes beyond the cooperation which is necessary between government, civil society, and private sector. But we make a step forward at Transparency International, and in particular with the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, where we do not try to only deal with this sort of moral hazard through agreements and integrity pacts, but we rather encourage different stakeholders to present their own interests and their own perspectives and their own needs to each other in a permanent deliberation where civil society and government and private sector interact. And this is the essence of EITI at the global level, where there is a Norwegian company where private sector and government and civil society have equal voting power, even though the civil society, for instance, with their coalition, Publish What You Pay coalition has about 500 members. They have the same voting power as about 52 natural resources countries and about 60 or so companies, oil companies, powerful players in the international market. So the interesting thing is there that we try to have a dialogue, a discourse between these different stakeholders. And we don't try to get people who have wisdom and look at everything at the same time and come to a wise decision. No, we look at people who are promoting their own interests very openly and respectfully and listen to the others, what are their interests and their needs and so on. And then these three actors get together and come to a compromise. And that underlying compromise then has more chances to be implemented. And of course, at EITI, this is happening at the global level with the secretariat in Oslo, in Norway, which has helped us to create that legal structure, but also in each country, in Nigeria, in the Congo, in Azerbaijan, but also in very good natural resources countries. So in many ways, this is a multi-stakeholder attempt to come to compromises in order to really affect decisions on governance. And I think this is extremely important because we managed at TI to have a lot of successes through collective action, but also to these multi-stakeholder processes which we put in place. And EITI is, of course, even structured like that, and has made tremendous progress since it was created about 20 years ago. And I'm so pleased to see that there is this common sense that there has to be an interaction between these three main actors of society. But I think it's also important to develop this further in the sense that these deliberations between these three actors of society and the stakeholders of society lead to compromise, which then gives people a mindset to implement what is created when an integrity system is created through better laws and better policies by governments. And just to say one more word, the excellent thing, of course, at EITI is that they have a secretariat, but the decisions, the analysis of what is wrong in a society is made in the countries themselves, based on their culture, on their capacities to build coalitions, to change, and so on. So this may become very much a new model of development assistance, of have a secretariat somewhere where you have some sort of broad global wisdom to support groups which sit in the individual countries, like Transparency International has it with its 130 national chapters all over the world. So we don't have this system where we try to impose ethical behavior on other countries. I think in Africa they are sick and tired of these conditionalities and so on. So we need a new system where we empower local groups, hopefully with a multi-stakeholder approach, to develop their own concepts on how to create an ethical environment and in particular also ethical behavior of big companies.
Thank you. And I think that's why you have ownership, you know, to the people at the local level of these initiatives.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you. By the power that is conferred on me as the moderator, I'm going to wait for, step down Annette's presentation to ask if anybody has any question for Andreas before he leaves. He's leaving in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So if you have any question for the EU, can we take that now for the next 5 minutes so that we can allow him? I don't want him to go without you asking your questions. I can see a hand here and one there. So we take those two. They are only for Andreas, not for the other panelists. please. Thank you.
Hello. I am a journalist from Moldova. I'm leading an investigative reporting team, and my question is maybe to everybody, but to Andrea too. My question is about the money from businesses that silence journalism and what can be done in this regard. Maybe you know all the businesses, or many businesses, and mostly international corporations, European corporations, have advertisement budgets, and it happens very often when those budgets goes to newsroom to silence journalists, not to publish stories. And there are cases when journalists do not publish stories but get the money. But there are cases when journalists publish the story and never get the money. And actually there is a huge problem in advertisement. Advertisement money goes to newsrooms that do not respect the ethics, goes to influencers that never have an ethics code, goes to big tech platforms like Facebook, Google, YouTube, that never check that those advertisement announcements break the ethics and breaks the human rights oftenly. Is there anything to be done to promote ethics in advertisements and to help human rights defenders and investigative reporters to do their job against corruption, not to be silent?
Thank you very much indeed. Please, may I ask you when you ask your question? Thank you. Please make it very precise because of time. Thank the next one.
Hello.
Yeah.
I'm also a documentary filmmaker, journalist. I'm surprised that you have no mention of the justice system in this panel today, because obviously companies may strive and do well in terms of tackling corruption, but if they basically know that once they're in court they have a good chance of winning, considering the amount of lawyers that they recruit, there's a fair imbalance, and it's evident to see when NGOs are going to court against big corporations. The same applies to a lobbyist in Brussels, for example. So I think that should be a point of interest in your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to that, regards to the panel members later. But Andreas, if you have those two questions, any response?
Yes. Excuse me. Thank you. On this first point in Moldova, I mean, I don't know precisely this case. What I would say is this sounds to me not necessarily something where EU money is involved, but it is more, to me, a rule of law potential problem in that country. And I think as Moldova is a candidate country for EU accession, I think these kind of systematic problems in the field of rule of law will certainly be considered. I'm sorry that I cannot be more specific. I don't know your particular case, but we are, of course, looking into rule of law issues. As you know, and this maybe links into the second question, the functioning of the justice system is a key criterion if you enter the EU. And if you are in the EU, we have a so-called mechanism, rule of law conditionality mechanism, where we can suspend money from the EU budget for member states, which we find in violation of certain rule of law principles. And these rule of law principles can, of course, also be related to corruption. One case where we have applied this is Hungary. This is quite well known. We have frozen the payout of 6.3 billion euros from the EU budget to Hungary because we feel there are persistent rule of law problems in this country. So I would say the functioning of the justice system here, of course, I can only speak for the EU. I cannot speak more broadly. Is something we take extremely seriously, both in the process of accession to the EU, but also when then countries are members of the EU.
Thank you. Okay, just dead on time, 11:45. So we're going to allow Andreas to leave. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to come to you now, Annette, with regards to collective action. To date, Siemens Settlements has been committed to 85 projects in over 50 countries for the settlement with the World Bank. Can you please share Siemens' experience with collective action? What have been the opportunities and the challenges, in terms of implementing all these projects? Yeah. Over to you.
Very, very happy to do so. As a very concrete example, again, in a very bad moment of our company's history, when the corruption scandal popped up, the settlement with the World Bank, and then following also with the European Investment Bank, where we were obliged to invest $120 million into the fight against corruption to really create level playing fields. I think we could have done and spent the money very differently. So if I now look back, so it's still ongoing. As you said, Yobi, until now there are 86 projects in so many different countries. So we have so many different learnings, so many challenging but also very humbling situations to really see where can you make an impact and where not, what did work, what not. So there are a lot of very concrete examples what you can do. And it starts with this transformation can no one do alone, right? And this is what has been discussed over and over again. We only can do it jointly. So you need to create a very robust ecosystem in which you can actually then create the impact. And I think with the Siemens Integrity Initiative, over all these years now, we were able to establish, to bring together different stakeholders. We have been really developing a very strong ecosystem community here. People that are so engaged, so passionate about making a difference. And so to me, key learnings where I would say these are really concrete examples how you can actually make a difference. It's first of all, and it also references a little bit to the questions you had on the judiciary system, why have we not been mentioning it, right? It's really making collective action a norm, something that is recognized as being a very important, vital element in the fight against corruption. And I think it's a huge success that now collective action has been implemented in the OECD guidelines as one of the elements how you can actually fight corruption. So that international corporations are committed to actually use this instrument. So make it a norm. Bring it into the administrative systems. Again, making use of the ecosystem that is out there. Then what is also key is investing in the future. What do I mean with that? Education, upskilling is really key. And I think if I look at the ecosystem and if I look at the projects that we have been investing into with the money, there are some of the stakeholders I just want to mention, and that is the Basel Institute of Governance, but also the UNODC, but then also the International Anticorruption Academy in Vienna. All of them, I mean, we are really investing into education, into training. With the UNODC, we have been developing, I think, around 350 lectures, with, in the end now, around 40,000 students that have been receiving training in Pakistan, Mexico, and Kenya. At the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Vienna, there is now a certificate where students can get lessons, and then the certificate in the end on the anti-corruption certificate for collective action. So in those courses, they learn very concrete examples on what can be done in very difficult environments. Again, to make a change in administrations, in public procurement? How can we engage with governments? How can we engage with civil society? How can we engage with academia, but also with private companies to really make a difference there? So in all of these projects, we have very concrete learnings. And if you are interested in some concrete examples, there is the new annual report on the Siemens Integrity Initiative. You can find it on our webpage that really lists all the contents of this project with very clear KPIs to really measure also the impact and then to take it with you into your respective ecosystem. So I think with the Siemens Integrity Initiative, we have learned that it works only in a strong ecosystem. It doesn't work in 1 year or two. To really achieve the transformation, it takes years. We need to continue. We need to very actively engage. And we also need money that is invested to really make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're going to go into the Q&A now. If you have questions, please make it very brief and to the point. So if you have any question or questions, please let's take them now. I have somebody over there. Over there. If you can just stand up, maybe we come to this middle here, so I can see you, and then if you can come to the middle here. Can we do that? If you have questions, please.
Hi, morning.
Yes.
Thank you for the panel. I'm Wolfgang Kühling. I'm with the Integrity Vice Presidency of the World Bank and the lead for prevention. We still see about 50% of the corruption cases being supply side in the bank. And compliance, enforcement, regulation have a certain effect. They also have negative effects like the FCPA. We don't see American companies in certain markets bidding. So how do we change the incentives within the companies and within the industries? Would it help to have ESG standards and rated criteria? Would it be to have other standards that we would take into account when we do public procurement? Education is great, public transparency is great, but how do we change the incentives? We had great experience when we had a collaboration with Global Fund, the pharmaceutical industry, USAID, and the bank to understand the corruption in the supply chain of malaria medication, and we resolved some issues. So what is it that changes the incentives?
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Please help me keep it simple, short, to the point. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Professor M.T. Ladan from Nigeria. My question is to the panelists. Since we are re-emphasizing the need for collective action, I would like to know from the panelists whether the UN guiding principles on business and human rights is of any relevance in building a global ethical economy while we seek to advance business integrity and its leaders. And I would also like to know from the panelists the level of compliance by the companies represented on this panel with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, because every act of corruption impacts the society, the consumers, and the economy in which the businesses are thriving. So what is the level of compliance with the UN guiding principle of human rights and business? Because that is more of a global framework than any regional or corporate or national instrument or framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Any other question? Okay, thank you.
Hi, Matthew King, the Head of Development and Partnerships for Transparency International. A question really for Klaus and Annette especially. Civil society has a reasonably strong relationship with I suppose, institutional donors, governments around the world, in particular the donor community. How does civil society and business work together to create the same type of investment model and corporate will? We talk about political will, but corporate will to invest in civil society more going into the future as funds decrease from other places. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I think we have some people here. Do you have? Huh? Okay. Please, yeah, you can go ahead and then we bring the mic here.
I'll try and be as brief as a lawyer can be.
Please, thank you.
My name is Dan Schneider. I used to be a lawyer with the Justice Department. Now I teach at American University. I have a question particularly for Alison. Starting in about the 1990s, the guiding principle, the prime directive of public corporations was shareholder value. And compensation packages are based largely on, well, what happened to our stock price in the past quarter, the past year? As long as that becomes the guiding principle, the real concern is, and I think the reality is, compliance programs, everything we've talked about takes a back seat to shareholder value. In this environment where this is kind of the way senior executives think, how is it really possible to have meaningful change on corporate behavior?
Thank you. Over here, please.
Yes.
Hi everybody. My name is Cecilia. I'm the CEO of MACN. It is great to see some of the favorite compliance champions on these panels, so great to see you here. I have the fortune to work with private sector almost daily in our initiative. So I see the changes, but I also see the challenges. But I think also we have to recognize at this conference that not a lot of these people who wants to do the change has access to CEOs. They don't have access to the boards on a daily basis. And there are some good examples out there for collective action, but we can also see there is an isolation between the roles of civil society, private sector, and governments, and we don't see enough of that. So I want to ask the panel to come up with 3 extremely concrete steps that civil society organizations who do not sit next to private sector can do, coming back to the title on how can they advance business integrity in the influence modules they have day to day, and to change that. So 3 concrete steps so we can be inspired. Thank you.
Thank you.
So good morning. My name is José Campanho. I'm from TI Brazil. In Brazil, we're living a time where investment structure, enforcement structure has been virtually dismantled over the last 5 or 6 years. It seems to me that this dynamic generated a decrease in investments from the company on their compliance initiatives and structures. My question to the panel is, if you understand to which extent this dynamic of less enforcement, less compliance can negatively impact the development of compliance on a global level. Thank you.
Do we understand that question? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Would that be all questions now? So that, okay. Okay. Klaus?
Yeah, maybe I focus a little bit on the supply chain, human rights, and your question about investments and the donations. The human rights topic, if I may start there, is of super relevance. And don't underestimate the efforts companies are undertaking to go into this topic. This has developed from a soft law to a hard law, I think, as Annette related to. It has to become very tangible. For us, it's a big part of the due diligence exercise we try to do. Easier said than done, because we are always at risk to overpromise. How do you assess human rights in a supply chain? Super difficult. You can ask questions, but you have to go there at the end. You have to do a community building. You can't do this globally. It has to be risk-based as well. But I want to bring this human rights. Yes, we all commit to the global standards, but it has to be very actionable. Ask the companies, what are you doing? Are you doing human rights due diligence, and if yes, where? How you define the reasons why you do the due diligence in this company, not in the other company. So I think many companies are doing this, but it has to be very tangible, very action-oriented. Forget the big statements. Every company is doing this. Action is the question. And then supply chain, maybe. It's super relevant that all the upcoming laws are not having a consequence that the big companies are leaving certain countries. This would be absolutely horrible. So also there, a big call out for collective action. We are trying to do this in the pharmaceutical industry, that we build coalition to help suppliers, not punish them only. Help them to develop good ethics, risk, and compliance system. Give them time if you find inconsistencies and failures to become better. If you just sort them out and leave the country, this will not be a better world afterwards. And then to the investments. I believe we have to move away from donations to capacity building. Just paying money somewhere, at least in our industry, we learned it the hard way, will not solve the issue. You have to do healthcare strengthening, where we give money, but it has to be in projects which serve a long value in the society. So you need to move away from these donations to what is really a strengthening of societal kind of muscle to fight corruption and other adverse events. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. Jisha?
Yeah, I wanted to focus a little bit on the questions around the justice system and enforcement. And I agree, it's absolutely crucial to all of this. We talk about carrots and sticks, right? Having incentives to be compliant, but at the same time, if you're not, what are the consequences? And what comes to mind is the current generation, right? If you look at Generation Alpha, Generation Z, the generations that have grown with supercomputers in their hands since they were, little, and they have this availability of information, whether it's misinformation or correct information. And so much of that sort of public perception drives enforcement. In my past life as a litigator dealing with enforcement agencies, many times the cases came because of what was in the press or what was being reported. And now the press is much bigger. It's anybody with a smartphone, anybody who has a blog, anybody who has a social media handle. And so I think that there is a different kind of incentive that is now coming with enforcement, where the public has so much more information at their hands and the ability to hold companies accountable. But absolutely agree that without the enforcement, nothing happens. And I think we've seen over the past 20 years, the cross-border cooperation has been extraordinary. And some of the biggest corruption cases that we see are the ones where multiple countries, prosecutors there, are cooperating with each other. And that'll be crucial to our future.
Thank you. Alison?
Yeah, so I mainly want to focus on the shareholder and executive pay point, but I just wrote a book arguing that we should base ethical principles and standards on the UN guiding principles. So just to agree there, but also to caution that as human rights start to move from soft law to hard law, there is a scenario where many ethical businesses withdraw from certain jurisdictions because the risk is too high. And I think we need to ask a lot of very difficult questions about what happens there, whereas if everyone is protecting themselves from legal and reputational risk, where we have a global footprint and where we are able to, make constructive efforts. To the point about shareholder value and maximizing shareholder value, I completely agree with you. But there are a couple of points, I think, that we can make here that have very positive implications. What the average investor and the average shareholder thinks and cares about has shifted and is shifting. The example I like to use in the class is Exxon Valdez, big oil spill in 1989. I think it affected the stock price of Exxon about 2%. Deepwater Horizon, 2009, about 60%, and the stock has never recovered. So there is something about how shareholder perceptions do align with societal shifts and societal norms. And then there's a lot of very interesting data that how companies create value has changed. It used to be based on tangible assets, cash, bonds, machines, inventory, land, that kind of thing. Now, value of corporations is to a very great extent intangible. So public perception, trust, network effects, brand, IP, software, that kind of thing. So I do think that corporations today are much more responsive for very, very good reasons to stakeholder perceptions and to what the public cares about. And maybe there is some cause for hope in there. But, in general, we have seen the rise of stakeholder capitalism rhetoric, but those shareholder value pressures are still as intense as ever. So I think we need to think more broadly and act more broadly on these questions.
Thank you. Nicola, any of the questions?
First, I would like to answer to the second question regarding the UN guiding principles. And I would like to underline that the standards coming from OECD, from UN, from Transparency International are really important for us that we work in the private sector. I mean, in the last 25 years, I have implemented anti-corruption programs in complex contexts for MNEs, SOEs, small and medium enterprises facing cultural barriers and sometimes criminal barriers. Okay, so if you put in my shoes and I have to deliver an anti-corruption program and present the anti-corruption program to the business, the only way that I have to have success is to have as a source OECD, Transparency International, and UN standards. So no one can say that it's wrong. So this is, so to the gentleman, yes, we follow the UN standards, we follow the OECD standards, and I think that is a critical success factor. On second, artificial intelligence is a game changer in changing direction, changing the approach, and the fight against corruption. It's a new stakeholder that we have to consider that is on our side that can help us to face issues. So please consider artificial intelligence, especially the generative AI, as a new colleague that can help us in changing the world.
Thank you. We were actually going to speak on artificial intelligence and all that, but because of our time and because we have a big panel, we just couldn't go ahead with some of the discussions we had for this afternoon, for this morning. Anyway, Annette, which one of the questions do you want to
I would take the one from the World Bank. So what really makes the difference? So if I reflect how we are approaching specifically difficult infrastructure projects, be it in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, where we also have World Bank or other multi-development bank financing involved. I think it also starts with thinking about what are the local specifics, what are the local specific challenges, and then again think through, and I think Peter, you mentioned it, really bringing everyone on the table and starting with discussing and then bringing on paper what are the games of the, what are the rules of the game. What is the level of integrity we want to establish, for example, for this infrastructure project? And then thinking about, do we need persons who are responsible for compliance, integrity, but also for health and safety issues on those specific projects? So again, it's about collectively thinking it through, bringing the right stakeholders on the table, and then actively engaging with each other, making sure that we all talk about the same thing when we talk about anti-corruption in regards to one infrastructure project. And these are really challenging situations we are facing day by day, but I think it's all about creating awareness, starting the discussion, and remaining engaged in the discussion. And then if something critical pops up, again, clean it up, and with a very clear commitment to that. Does it really make the difference? I don't know, but I think it's a continuous engagement to really make here transformation happening and not giving up. I think, Klaus, you touched on the human rights challenges. Already nothing to add from my side other than it's really about making it tangible, right? Where are human rights risks? Again, depending on in which country are you, what are the societal perspectives on the topic? Again, engaging in discussions, making sure that the partners in the whole ecosystem, in the whole value chain are talking about the same thing. And make it really concrete here. That's a big challenge, at least also for us as a global player, being in over 190 countries around the globe.
Thank you. Please give us about 4 or 5 more minutes. So, Peter?
Well, thank you very much. I will bring an example of impact of civil society interaction with government and private sector from the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Nigeria was a very interesting case, which was the first one under President Obasanjo to accept the idea of having the Extractive Industry Transparency International, the Transparency Initiative, to publish in particular the payments received by governments for the natural resources sector. And many of the countries in Africa didn't allow it, in particular Angola and so on. But President Obasanjo, who had just been relieved from prison of Mr. Abacha, and partly with our support, he has been released at one of the international anti-corruption conferences in 1997 in Peru. I meet a group like you stand up for a minute of silence in order to protect President Obasanjo, who was dying in prison of Abacha. But he came out and said, I'm going to allow EITI. And so they created a multi-stakeholder group under the chairmanship of Obi Ezekwesili, who later was the vice president at the World Bank, and about 30 people from every parts of civil society, private sector, and government. And they began to publish the payments received by the government in terms of taxes, royalties, signature bonuses, dividends. And for the first time, the Nigerians found out, including the parliament, including the media, including civil society, they found out how much money the power structure of Nigeria received from the oil companies. I don't want to ask you to make a guess, but it was $45 billion, not $45 million, $45 billion every year. And that money was not reflected in the government budget. It just went into suitcases to London to buy luxury apartments and so on. So this was probably in the open. And this is a case in which the interaction of civil society, private sector, and government through multi-stakeholder dialogue opened the eyes and gave tremendous opportunities of society to strengthen their governance. And we have many more examples like that, but I think this one is quite illustrative.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm told that we have to stop at now. But then I want to say that in the midst of the ever-changing world today, the risk of doing business keeps increasing. The geopolitical issues, or so many other challenges in the world. So also are the risk of doing business and the expectation of people, of society, and of the authorities all over the world. However, there are businesses that are doing business with integrity and working on collective action. So let us support businesses that are doing the right things. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and I want to thank all our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so very much to the panel. A very, very brief note for me. There are 2 more plenary sessions that will happen in this venue today, one of which is starting right after lunch at 1 on ending impunity from prevention to enforcement, and that's the one organized by the STT, Lithuanian Special Investigation Service. And there is lunch now in the usual lunch area. Do enjoy it, and let's meet here at 1 p.m. Thank you.